Okay. All right. So number 14, that is this et ha milchamot shama, or sorry, shamu ha mishpachot, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So we'll just walk through it kind of one step at a time and talk about what maybe the. I talked a little bit last time about kind of a process to go through when you're translating. It's not sort of intuitive. Part of the problem is in Futato, you don't really get a process. You just kind of have to figure it out intuitively. But what you can't do as far as translation goes is just go, first Hebrew word, translate that, second Hebrew word, translate that, third Hebrew word, translate that, like going in order like that. It's going to end up giving you a bad translation. And so there's kind of a two-step process. The first thing that you have to do is figure out what the Hebrew is saying, and then you have to figure out how English would say it because it's not always the same. So number 14 is a good example here. As we look at this sentence, I approach a sentence with sort of the expectation in Hebrew, not the requirement. It certainly isn't always the case, but I approach a sentence with the expectation or anticipation that it's going to start with the verb. That's not what's happening here, and we know that this is not a verb because we see this et particle. And et we have learned, we will learn another way that et works in the future. But so far, what we've learned from et is that this is a marker. It's almost like it's kind of like a punctuation mark, except it's marking function. And what this particle is doing is it's saying, hey, look at me. Whatever comes after me, that's going to be your direct object, which means that's the thing that the verb is being done to. All right, so now we can look at this word and try to figure out what it is. When I come to a Hebrew word and I see a hey at the beginning, I immediately think, hey, this might be the definite article. Doesn't have to be. There's a lot of words in Hebrew that start with a hey that don't have the definite article, but it's a possibility. So as I look, I'm looking primarily for the patak and the dagesh. Now that I have both of those with the hey, patak, dagesh, now this is more like kind of 90%, 95% chance this is the definite article here. So if it is, we should be able to take off the hey, the patak, and the dagesh and see a word that makes sense, or at least in Futato, a word that we've learned, which if we take those off, we would have milchamot, which is the plural form of a word that we've learned. We've learned milchama, and so this is milchamot. So this would be a noun. It's definite. It's also feminine plural. And the noun itself, the lexical form, means battle, but here in the plural, it's going to be battles. All right, so we would translate, or we would gloss this word as the battles. So whatever is happening in this sentence, it's happening to the battles. So what do we have next? Next we have shah ma'u. All right, shah ma'u, we haven't seen our verb yet, and we usually expect to start with the verb. So if the first word wasn't the verb, well, maybe the second word is the verb. So if I look at shah ma'u as the verb, do I see anything that confirms that? Well, a regular Hebrew root is supposed to have 3 letters. I have 4. So what's extra? Well, since we've only learned the cal perfect so far, it's probably the suffix, because the cal perfect adds a suffix to a verb in order to conjugate it. So what suffix do I have? Well, if I start at the end, I've got a shurek. What forms of the cal perfect use a shurek? There's 2. One of them is going to be the cal perfect 1CP. It uses a noon shurek, which I do not have here. I have no noon. The other one that uses a shurek is the cal perfect 3CP, which is just a shurek suffix, and that's what we do have. So that confirms that this shurek suffix means that whatever I'm looking at here, it's most likely a cal perfect 3CP. So if I take off the shurek, if I take off the suffix, what am I left with? Do I have 3 Hebrew letters then? I do, okay? Are these 3 Hebrew letters a real actual root for a Hebrew verb? Shen, mem, ayin. Yes, those 3 letters form the verbal root of shema, which means, in the lexical form, he heard or he listened to. But in the 3CP form, it's going to mean they heard or they listened to. So now I've got my verb, and I'll gloss it as they heard. All right, so or I could just say heard. But I'm just putting a gloss here by the word to kind of remind me of what I've figured out so far about the sentence, so that when I switch over to my English translation, it's easy for me to grab the parts that I need. All right, then we tackle our final word. Again, we have a word that begins with a hey, so that could be a definite article. Let's look for the patak dagesh. Sure enough, we have a patak dagesh. So that's almost certainly the definite article. If I take off the hey, patak dagesh, am I left with a word that I know? If I take that off, I'm left with mishpachot, and that's very close to a word that I know. That's very close to mishpacha. And of course, in the feminine, a feminine plural noun is usually going to get the holem vav tav ending, replacing the kametz hey ending. So this makes perfect sense as a noun that is definite. It is a feminine plural form of mishpacha. Mishpacha, from my vocabulary, means family or clan, and so mishpachot would mean families or clans. And we would gloss this as the families or the clans. All right, so now I've addressed the meaning of the Hebrew sentence. I've addressed everything that it means, but I can't just write all of this down and say it's English. If I did, I would get the battles heard the families, and that doesn't make any sense in English. So what I have to do now is I have to go into stage 2, which is the actual translation part, where I realize, okay, I'm going to reorient. I'm going into English now. How does English build a sentence? Well, in English, we always start with the subject. So I have to come back over here and find my subject in the Hebrew. Now I have two nouns. The subject would have to be a noun or a pronoun. I have two of them to choose from. How do I know which of these two is my subject? Is it hamilchamot or is it hamishpachot? Well, the way that I know it's not hamilchamot is because this has the definite direct object marker. So I know that this noun has to be functioning as the direct object. Now, honestly, in Hebrew, I don't need a subject noun in the sentence. My subject might just have to be they. So if it's they heard the battles, then what in the world is hamishpachot doing in the sentence? If this is not the subject, what would its function be? So far, we've only really learned two functions of a noun in a Hebrew sentence. That's the direct object, which we've already decided is hamilchamot, and we've learned the subject is another function of a noun in a Hebrew sentence. And so this is probably my subject noun, but in order for it to qualify as my subject noun, it has to agree with the verb in gender, number, and person. Well, the verb is third person, so that works. Almost every noun is going to be a third person noun unless it's a second person pronoun or a first person pronoun. So we got the match or the agreement in person. The verb is common, which means it can take either a masculine or a feminine subject, so that's no issue. And then finally, it's plural, 3CP, it's plural. So my subject has to be plural. Well, sure enough, mishpachot is plural. So we've just confirmed that hamishpachot is almost certainly the subject of this sentence. English starts with the subject. And so we have to take hamishpachot and our gloss, and we have to start our English sentence for that. Our gloss for hamishpachot was the families. So we have to take the families, and that is how we're going to start our English translation. I know it's the third word in the Hebrew sentence, but English has to start with the subject, and that's what we've determined that hamishpachot is. So we start with the families. Then English wants to know what our verb is. Once we've got our subject, we now go to our predicate, and the first part of our predicate usually is the main verb. Well, we decided that that was sham'u. All right, and so now we can take the gloss of sham'u, which is either they heard if we don't have a subject, or simply heard if we do have a subject, which we do. And we can just move heard down here. So the families heard, and then English will take the direct object, the battles. All right, so now we've got the families heard the battles. Now here's the tricky part, and again, I went through this I think it was a couple video conferences ago. The way that Futato handles this is quite confusing for most students. In fact, in the last week, I've had two other students ask me about this, and so I can also put a link to the discussion of this in the description of this video once we post it. But what Futato's trying to do here with the not the animals part is he's just doing this to indicate that et hamilchamot was fronted in the sentence. It was pushed toward the front of the sentence, which is out of place from where you would normally see it. The phrase not the animals, that is not in the Hebrew. And so that shouldn't be in your translation. And so it shouldn't be in Futato's translation. So why does he put it here? Well, he wants you to know that because the direct object is fronted, Hebrew is sort of emphasizing that the important part of this sentence is the direct object. And so what this is saying, the proper translation would be the families heard the battles, but maybe a more interpretive translation would be something like the battles are what the families heard. But again, that has to bring in a direct object, or not a direct object, that has to bring in a relative clause. And we don't want to do that if we don't have to, because it's not, I hate to use the term literal, but it's not as literal, it's not as word for word of a translation. So what he does by saying not the animals, all that does is clarify that we're not saying that the this is it's a really bad example. Let me put it this way. If you translated 14 and you got the families heard the battles, you understand what you need to understand about Hebrew translation so far. This again is just trying to point out, it's as if someone's saying it this way. The family heard the battles. The battles are what the family heard, as opposed to something else. Now, the fact that context doesn't supply any alternative, that tells you that there shouldn't be an alternative here. This is just the only way that he has found, or maybe what he thinks is the most effective way to point out that there's emphasis on battles here because it's fronted in the sentence. It's moved to the beginning of the sentence where you wouldn't expect the direct object to be. Does that make any kind of sense at all, Kristen?
Yes, that helps a lot. And I think I also was struggling with the new plural endings of the words. So I think I was trying to make it kingdom for some reason. So that was part of my problem too, I think.
Yeah, and it makes sense for milchamot here. It's very close to the word for kingdom. Kingdom is malkut, and so you've got a lot of similarities there. But yeah, it's a lot of different stuff going on in this sentence that can lead to, if you don't stumble over anything in this sentence, you're doing a great job, because not only does it have the plural endings that were introduced a couple lessons ago but we haven't worked with a whole lot, not only does it have an unusual word order, he also throws in this extra phrase that isn't really there. So there's a lot about this one that that makes sense why it would be confusing. But That's the way that he presents it, so that's my explanation of why he does it that way. Again, on the quizzes, if you get a sentence like this, you should not put anything in parentheses here. The only reason he's doing that is to kind of show you that the sentence is emphasizing the direct objects. The battles is what the family heard, not something else. And so he just throws in randomly animals as opposed to battles or something. But again, that is not in the Hebrew at all. Any other questions? Todd, I see that you've joined us. Welcome. Anything that you want to go over before we take a look at last week's exercises?
No, actually, I had the same question about the word order, and then where in the world animals
Yeah,
came from.
yeah, it's not there. He's just offering it as something else that maybe someone was confused and they thought that the family heard animals. And this sentence is saying, no, they didn't hear animals. The battles is what they heard. You know, the family heard the battles is being emphasized. But like I say, it's a very strange way to communicate that emphasis.
Agreed.
All right. Well, if Kristen, anything else you want to go over?
Oh, no, I'm good. I'm sorry, I messed my screen up.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Well, let me go ahead and pull that up then. And again, if anything does come up, I've got you guys over here where I can see if you wave at me. But if I ignore you, feel free to jump in. It's just because I'm so focused on what I'm doing here. So let's pull up practice for number 7. Let me look at the assignment here. A, B, D, and H. All right. So we'll kind of walk through sort of an accelerated version of that for these. But the pattern that I want you to pick up on is this process of let's go ahead and address the Hebrew word by word to figure out what's going on. But that does not, we don't stop there. You know, that is not a translation. That's just sort of interpreting well, I shouldn't say interpreting even, but that's just sort of analyzing the Hebrew sentence. Once we do that and we fully analyze the sentence, now we can turn to English and say, okay, how would English express what we have found? So number 1 here, we've got Zachar, pretty straightforward. Hebrew can. Now, I don't know of any verses in the Bible where a whole sentence is just one word as far as Hebrew goes. I might look and see if I can find something like that. But theoretically speaking, you don't need a subject here because the subject is implied by the form of the verb that's chosen. Zachar will only be used when you have a third-person masculine singular subject. And so it doesn't need who as a pronoun here. It doesn't need to be Zachar who. It can simply be Zachar, and that just means he remembered. So because there's only one word, you don't have to worry about the word order and everything and analyzing the Hebrew and then translating it into English. If you wanted to, you could say, okay, let's analyze this word. How many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? 3. How many do I have? I have 3. Oh, okay, great. This might be my root. Are these 3 letters a legitimate Hebrew verbal root? Well, the first way that I would answer that is, have I learned this one? And of course, in this workbook, he's not going to give you any roots that you haven't learned yet. So yes, but what if I hadn't seen this one? What if this was some combination of letters that I hadn't seen? Because I guarantee you, once you get out of elementary Hebrew and you start reading in your Hebrew Bible, you're going to come across all kinds of roots that you haven't seen. You can't rely on your vocabulary knowledge because that's very limited. So when you come to this and you ask the question, is this a legitimate Hebrew verbal root? Your memory can't confirm that because you haven't learned it yet. So before you just say no, you really need to go to your lexicon and check. Look under Zion, then look under Zion Chaf, and then look under Zion Chaf Resh. And if you find that root, then yes, this is almost certainly going to be that root. And you might think, well, why are we even so worried? Like, there are no suffixes. This is obviously the root, right? For now, yes. But once we get into weak verbs, once we get into the imperfect and some of the weak verbs, 3 letters isn't always your root. There are letters that get lost. And so maybe you lose the final letter of your root and a suffix gets added. And in that case, you would have 3 letters, but they're not necessarily the root. So that's why I'm kind of introducing that now. But this is a legitimate Hebrew root. It makes perfect sense in this context because there is no context. So there's no reason to doubt that this is Zachar, Cal Perfect 3MS, which would mean he remembered. There's really nothing else to do. We can go to English and we can say, okay, English, what do you want first? English wants the subject first. Okay, so what's the subject? Well, the implied subject is he. So we'll put he down. Boom. All right, now English, what do you want after the subject? I want the verb. Okay, what's the verb? The verb is remember. It's simple past tense, so we're going to say remembered, and then we put the verb down, and boom, we're good to go. Pretty simple when you've only got one word. It's not too hard once you get 2 words, but when you get 3 or more, it can get a little tricky. So let's look at number 2. Here we've got Zachar Ha'ish. And so now the question really comes to the spotlight. We just dealt with Zachar, so we know what it means. It means remembered, and it implies a third-person subject that is singular and masculine. But now we've got Ha'ish here, and we have to figure out what to do with this, because Ha'ish, again, starts with a hey, could be a direct, or it could be a definite article. We're going to look for the Patak Dagesh. We don't see it, but there's a reason why we don't see it, because here we've got the ayin, or I'm sorry, we've got the aleph, which cannot take a Dagesh, and so the Patak lengthens to a kametz. So when I see hey, kametz, aleph, that's pretty good confirmation that we've got a definite article. If it's a definite article, I should be able to take the hey, kametz off and see a real Hebrew word. And I do, I get ish, which means man or husband maybe. So this means the husband or the man, and it is a noun. But of course, we have to figure out what its function is in this sentence. And that's a great question, because in Hebrew, there's a couple options. Word order does not dictate what the function is. So this could be subject, because subject may come after the verb, or it could be the direct object. So this could be either the man remembered, or it could be he remembered the man. That is to say, someone remembered the man. How do I know which it is? Couldn't it be both in Hebrew? No, it cannot be both in Hebrew, because if I have a direct object that's definite, I'm going to expect to see that et particle, et or ate, and I do not see that here. So if this were the direct object, because it's definite, I should see et or ate here, and I do not. That means that this is almost certainly not the direct object. Well, what else can it be? At that point, the only other option is subject. So we should not translate this sentence as he remembered the man, because in English, that implies that a man is being remembered, not just remembering something. So we would better translate this as the man is the subject, remembered is the verb. Because we know this is the subject, we can go through our English process and say, okay, English, what do you want first? English wants the subject first. Okay, what's my subject? Ha'ish. I put ha'ish in there, the man. And then I ask English, what do you want after the subject? English wants the main verb. Okay, what's my main verb? Zachar, remembered. So now I can put that in there. But this is one that often trips students up because we're just sort of in this autopilot of using the same word order in English that we have in Hebrew. For some reason, we feel like it's more literal that way. And literal is not the right word for that. But this is a perfect example of how too literal of a translation is actually going to be misleading. If we just translate this as he remembered the man, that is not what the Hebrew is saying. All right, so number 3 here, what about this one? We've got ani zacharti. Ani zacharti, again, we can start with our first word, which I anticipate will be a verb, but I don't have to look at it very long to find out that this is not a verb. So this is not the typical word order. That could imply some emphasis. There may be other reasons why the word order would switch around in Hebrew, but it could imply emphasis. Again, it does not tell me necessarily what the function of this word is, because in Hebrew, the word order does not determine the function. All right, so what do we have here? What is ani? Have I seen this before? If I haven't, if I don't recognize it at all, then I better go to my lexicon and look up aleph nun and see what I can find there. The hirik yod that you see, this is a very common suffix in Hebrew, so I might kind of leave that off when I'm in my lexicon, just to make sure, you know, maybe it is a suffix. But it's not. Here, ani is just the pronoun for I. It's one of the pronouns. There's also anochi, but here this is the shortened form of the pronoun for I. So this is a 1cs pronoun. Now, in order for this pronoun to be the subject, it has to agree with the verb in being 1cs. So I'm kind of suspecting that zacharti here is 1cs before I even look at it. But let's go ahead and look at it. How many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? 3. How many do I have? I have 5 if I count the yod. So what should I take off in order to get back to the root? What are my suffixes? Do I have any cal-perfect verbs that use hirik yod as a suffix? Because, and I ask that because that's the farthest letter. I know we have to take off more than one letter, but let's just start at the very end. What would allow me to take off the yod? Well, as it turns out, in the cal-perfect, there's only one form that uses a hirik yod at the end, and it doesn't just use the hirik yod, it uses a tav hirik yod. And as it turns out, that's what I have. So this suffix gets used for the cal-perfect 1cs. So I've confirmed agreement between my potential subject and my verb. If I take the t suffix off, I'm left with zachar, which I've seen before. This is my root for remember. So since it's cal-perfect, it's going to be remembered, and since it's 1cs, it's going to be I remembered. But I can get all that just from the verbal form. We've added the 1cs pronoun, which is not only unnecessary, but it's also fronted. The subject will usually come after the verb. So I would say in this specific situation where you've got a superfluous subject pronoun and it's fronted at the beginning of the sentence, this probably means I remembered with emphasis on I. That is to say, you may not have remembered, but I remembered. So that, again, we're not going to translate it as you may not have remembered in parentheses. We're just going to say I remembered, but understand that there's probably some sort of emphasis on the subject pronoun I here. All right, let's look at the rest of these and see if there's anything else tricky. Pretty much the same thing when we go down to number 4. It's just a different subject. So instead of 3ms, it's now 3fs. But again, same. Number 5 is the same as number 2. It's just gone feminine now. Remember, your subject has to match your verb with respect to gender and number. Number 6, we've shifted to the 2mp, so that's you all, masculine, remembered. Number 7, we get the 3cp, and so we can look at number 7 here the same way we looked at number 2. If we look at number 7, we say zachiru. How many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? 3. How many do I have? I have 4. So what should I take off? Let's start at the end with a suffix, shurik. The simple shurik suffix belongs to the 3cp form, so this would be they remembered. And then I've got to figure out what to do with ha-anashim. Again, I've got a definite article here, so I can take that off. Anashim is the plural form of ish, which means man or husband, and so this would be men or husbands. And with the article, it would be the men or the husbands. But now I have to ask, what is the function of ha-anashim in this sentence? Is this to be translated as they remembered the men, as if the men were being remembered, Or is this to be translated where the men are the ones remembering? The men remembered. The first option would mean that this is the direct object. The second option would mean that this is the subject. If this were the direct object, since it has the article, since it's definite, I would expect the et particle here, and I do not see that particle, so I don't think this is the direct object. It makes more sense that this is the subject. Now, if it's the subject, it has to agree with the verb. It has to be third person. It has to be, well, it can be masculine or feminine because this is a common form of the verb, but it does have to be plural. Sure enough, third person, this happens to be masculine, and it is plural, so we do have agreement. Therefore, when I go over to English now, English, what do you want first? English wants the subject first. Okay, what's my subject? We decided that ha-anashim is the subject. So I'm going to put the men as my subject. All right, English, what do you want after the subject? English wants the main verb next. All right, so now I go to zachuru, and I grab remembered as the translation for zachuru, and I put it in my sentence. And pretty straightforward there again, with just 2 words. It's not too tricky, but if you can get that process down in your mind of translation, of first I analyze the Hebrew, then once I go into English, I check with what English wants first. English wants the subject first, then it wants the verb, then it wants any direct object or anything like that. So number 8 is going to be the same. We've just shifted from ha-anashim, men, to ha-nashim, which is women. Number 9, we switch to the verb batach, so 3ms form here. Again, if you've got another noun, and it's definite, but it doesn't have et, it's almost certainly your subject. Is there agreement? 3ms form. Ben is masculine singular. That works. Number 10, batacha. Here we've gone to 3fs, but we've switched our subject to feminine singular, so that matches. Number 11, we have ata, batachta. So ata is the you pronoun, masculine singular, but we've got the 2ms form, so that agrees. Here, ata is unnecessary because it's just a pronoun and it's already implied by the verbal form. But not only is it unnecessary, it's also fronted. We usually expect the subject after the verb in typical Hebrew word order. So that would tell me that there's probably some sort of emphasis here on you trusted. Then number 12, we've got attain, so same thing, it's just now feminine plural, and so we switch the verb form to the feminine plural, still second person. Number 13, batachnu, this is the 1CP form. We have no subject to worry about, and so we just say we trusted. Number 14, halach is our verb, 3ms form. We've got hanavi, it's definite, but we don't have et, so this is probably the subject instead of the direct object. If it's the subject, it has to match. It has to be third person masculine singular since the verb is masculine singular. Navi is masculine singular, so that works. We go to English. Hey, English, what do you want first? I want the subject first, so we take hanavi, the prophet. We put it in our translation. English, what do you want after the subject? English wants the main verb after the subject, so we go back to our verb. Walked, the prophet walked. And then finally, we've got haim, ha-lahu. Haim is they, masculine plural, as a pronoun. Ha-lahu, 3CP, everything agrees, works perfect. Any question about section A there before we move on to the next one? At a certain point, with all of these, simple sentences, when I do 15 of them in a row, it seems kind of repetitive and unhelpful. But I do want to make sure that it all makes sense. Let's take a look here. Looks like section B is going to focus on the direct object. But here's a good kind of, I think this one's worth talking about. So let's look at number 1 and B here. We've got lakach, sus. All right, so again, stage 1 is we're going to analyze the Hebrew. I anticipate that the first word is the verb. Sure enough, this is a verb form that I'm familiar with. I recognize the root lakach, and I recognize the vowel pattern without a suffix as indicating 3ms. This is my lexical form. It means either he took or it took. What's my next word here? Well, this is a noun. It means horse. It's masculine singular, so it fits as the subject. But the noun could also function as the direct object. How do I decide which one it is? I can't rely in this case on the fact that there's no et particle because it's not definite. And so I wouldn't expect et to be there for the direct object if it's not definite. So there is nothing, looking at these 2 words, there is nothing syntactic, well, let me not say it that way. There's nothing here that immediately indicates whether sus is the subject or the direct object. I mean, aside from the fact that he says focus on the direct object. Ignore that for now. Right now I have a noun and I have a verb. And I have to determine how this noun is functioning. Since I don't have more context that would help me decide which one makes more sense, I now have to go to, and honestly, I shouldn't say now because this should probably be your first indication. Before you look at the broader context, you should think about the meaning of the words. Does sus make more sense as the subject of took, or does it make more sense as the object of took? And there's 2 reasons why it makes more sense as the object. The first reason is it's hard for a horse to take anything. It doesn't really have hands. So now it could take with its big old teeth, I suppose, so that's one possibility. Maybe it took the carrot. But here's the other problem. Lakach, semantically, as far as what it means, it almost requires a direct object. If I say he seized, or he took, or he captured, it feels incomplete because that type of verb, that type of action, almost requires an object. It's really almost always transitive is the term we use for that. When a verb takes an object, that means it's transitive. Took at least in English. And you can't always assume that a parallel verb in Hebrew, you know, if, for example, took or captured or seized is never intransitive in English, you can't automatically assume that lakach will never be intransitive in Hebrew, because it may just work differently. But for that, as the second reason, that's another reason why I say this must be the direct object. It makes way more sense to translate this sentence as, he took a horse, than to translate this sentence as, a horse took. So that's the translation I would go with. But there's nothing here marking this sentence that necessarily tells you that sus is the object versus the subject. You just kind of have to depend on what the words mean to show that sus makes more sense as the object. And that's what he goes with here. All right, so here we've introduced the ate particle because it's definite. So here it's obvious that this means he took the horse. Here, number 3, the only difference between number 2 and number 3 is we've now connected the words. That does not change the meaning of the sentence at all. It means the exact same thing. It's just most of the time you get et with the makef, sometimes you get ate without the makef, but it means the same thing. Number 4, here we've gone to shalach as the verb, but again, we've got et with the definite article, so this tells us that we've got our direct object here. The only difference between number 4 and number 5 is what the direct object is. In number 4, he took a boy or a servant or a young man. In number 5, he took a priest, or the priest, I should say. He took the servant, he took the priest. Now, Kristen, I can see your box lit up. I don't know if you have background noise or if you're trying to say something, but you're still muted. So if it's just background noise, no problem. I just want to make sure you weren't asking a question and I was ignoring you. So.
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. So we did 5. So number 6, here we've got Shema, he heard, and then Davar. Well, just like number 1, it's ambiguous. Davar could be the object or it could be the subject. It agrees with the verb. There's no disagreement here, so it makes sense. But then you have to think about the meaning of the words. Does a word or a message or a matter or thing, however you want to translate Davar, is listening or hearing something that a Davar can do? The meanings don't work together for Davar to be the thing listening. But it makes perfect sense for Davar, a word, a matter, a thing, it makes perfect sense for Davar to be the thing that is heard, for it to be the direct object. So here we would translate this obviously as he heard a word. Number 7 and 8, we make it definite. So because we've made it, well, I guess number 7, because number 8 is a different object. But with number 7, we make it definite here. That means we add in the ate particle because it's a definite direct object, and so ate marks that definite direct object. With number 8, we've just switched the object to king, but we've still got the et particle with the makef here, indicating that it is the direct object. All right, any questions on B while I look up the next section here? D and H. All right, let's take a look at D. All right, on here, again, we have to deal with this annoying negative again. So I'm just going to kind of point out what might be confusing here. In all 4 of these, if you got all 4 of these, or any 4 of these on a quiz, any 4 of these Hebrew sentences on a quiz, you should translate them as the boy gave the garment, and nothing else. No matter which of these 4 translations you see on a quiz, or sentences you see on a quiz, the translation should be the boy gave the garment. Because that would be the English, that would be the way that English says all 4 of these. He has added his parenthetical notes here to indicate where the emphasis might be. So because in number 1, it's just a straightforward verb, subject, direct object, there's no need to indicate any emphasis. But in number 2, we are negating the noun, which is to say, giving is not what the boy did with the clothing. He may have done something else with it, like he may have kept it, but he certainly did not give it. In number 3, what we're negating here is hana'ar. Hana'ar is the boy or the servant, and so whatever's happening in this sentence, whoever is giving the clothing, it is not the boy. So maybe it's the girl who gave it. And then finally, number 4 here, we're negating the direct object. So whatever the boy was giving, it was not the clothing. So maybe it was the shoes or something like that. But again, that's his logic for these parenthetical notes here. I know it's confusing. You certainly won't need to do any of that parenthesis on the quiz, but that's what's going on. All right, and so let's look at number, I think it's H is the last one here. Yeah, H to finish up here. All right, so H, this is just kind of combining everything that we've learned so far. So number 1, Zachar, Hamelech, et Hamalchut. Zachar is our verb, and so we just kind of gloss that, remembered. Our next word, Hamelech, this is a noun, but it's not the direct object because it's definite, but it doesn't have the definite direct object particle. Hamalchut does have that. Okay, so we already know this is our subject, this is our direct object. The king is the subject, the kingdom is the object. All right, English, what do you want first? Well, I want the subject first. That's the king, so we put the king in. What do you want after the subject? I want the verb, so we put the verb in. The king remembered. And then finally, we take our direct object. The king remembered the kingdom. The rest of these are pretty much the same pattern. Here we've got lakachti na'ar. Is na'ar the subject or is it the object? We don't know. I mean, we don't have et, but it's not definite, so we wouldn't expect et. So now we have to think through the meaning of the words. Does it make sense for a boy to seize nothing? No. So it doesn't really make sense for na'ar to be the subject. Does it make sense for me to seize the boy or the servant? That makes more sense. But even before we get there, we can realize that there's actually no agreement between na'ar and the verb. The verb form is the 1CS. Na'ar is not a first-person word. Na'ar would be third person, so it has to be the object, which means our translation then will be, I took a boy. Number 3, we've got a little bit, there's a little bit of ambiguity, but there's not when we realize, hey, we don't have the definite direct object marker. So we've got agreement between ha'em, that's feminine singular, and ha'lacha, that's feminine singular, but we don't have the et particle, which means this is not our direct object. So we have to translate this subject first, the mother, then our verb, went or walked. Number 4, we've got shalchu. So this is going to be 3CP. Our first noun is masculine plural, so that would agree. Our second noun is masculine singular, so that would not agree with the verb. Plus we've got 8, indicating that it's direct object. So our translation would be, the gods sent the prophet. Number 5, Shema, 3MS. Our next word, kohen, is masculine singular, so it could be the subject, but davar is also masculine singular, so davar could be the subject. Typical word order would have the subject come immediately after the verb and then the direct object. Let's see if that makes sense. A priest heard a word. That makes sense. What if we switch the order? A word heard a priest. That does not make sense. So here, kohen must be our subject, shema our verb, and davar our direct object. English, what do you want first? I want a subject, so we go with kohen, a priest. What do you want after the subject? I want the verb, heard, a priest heard. And then it will take the object, a priest heard a word. Finally, number 6, we've got lechachtem et hasusot. So here we have no subject explicit. We know that this noun hasusot is going to be the direct object because of the et marker. And so we can start with, English, what do you want first? I want the subject. Well, we don't have an explicit subject. We'll have to infer the subject from the form of the verb. Lechachtem is going to be the 2MP, so we're just going to say you masculine plural, took. What did you take? Et hasusot, the horses. You took, oh, and so again, in English, mares, it's not as common of a word as horse would be, but mare is just the word for a female horse. So you took the mares, or I'll take you took the horses. All right, any other questions before we shut it down? Just want to make sure it all makes sense. But pretty straightforward. I do want to say on this week's lesson, lesson number 8, I put out in the announcement, don't let these rules freak you out. Don't get overwhelmed by them. The whole point of this lesson is to just help you make some sense out of the vowel changes that you see, but don't let this information be more confusing to you because you're not going to be tested on this information. This lesson is just to help explain what's going on. So any questions before we wrap it up?
I had one on number 5 you just did there.
Yeah.
You said that the sentence order usually goes verb, subject, then object.
Yes.
And that's pretty standard.
Yeah, he covers that in this section 7.7. Typical, again, typical is a very loose term. Typical word order is verb first, then your subject, and then any object you might have. But when he says typical, that's maybe like 55 to 60% of the time, so just be aware of that.
I had a quick question. Oh, sorry, time.
No, it's okay. My question was, how typical is that?
Yeah, it's the majority of the time, but it's certainly not like 80% or anything like that.
And context should be our key in
Yeah.
translation. Okay, thank you.
Just my question was, if it has the et or the 8, it will be a direct object. Is that always the case? Like, will there be a direct object without those?
I will tell you, there are some very rare situations where you will have a definite direct object and it might lack et or 8, but when you see et or 8 there in front of a definite direct object, or in front of a definite noun, so far that means it's the direct object. Now, unfortunately, we're doing prepositions next week, I think. I don't know if it's this one. Let's see. Yeah, we're not learning this preposition yet, but at a certain point we will learn about a preposition that looks identical to this definite direct object marker. It's just a coincidence, okay? It's just like we have homonyms in English where the same word, I bear up under a burden versus a bear was chasing me through the forest. Like, they don't have any meaning relationship to one another, but they happen to look identical. There is a preposition that means to or toward, or I'm sorry, no, that's L. There's a preposition that means with that looks identical to this marker, but if this is the direct object marker, then it will be the direct, like you're not going to see this marker pop up randomly unless it's with a definite direct object, unless it's that preposition. So there's really not a good answer to that question because of that. But if it's not the preposition, then yes, it will be the direct object.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, guys, well, I got another meeting starting up. If you do have any other questions, feel free to email me, send them, and I will post this video later with a link. I mentioned at the beginning, which I can't remember. I think Kristen might have been in for this, but there was discussion about the negatives that obviously is still confusing, that I will link to that once I post this, but that should be it for now. Don't forget that for week 8 on your midterm, you need to have a proctor for that, for the midterm and the final exam. If you have any questions, send them to me. Any adult can serve as the proctor, and they just need to send me an email saying, hey, I was with whoever for the entire quiz. They didn't use any resources or aids, and they took it in one sitting. But I'll post that in the Unit 8 announcement with full details. All right, thanks so much, guys. We'll see you next time.